Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Genevieve Melford, Managing Director of the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Our mission is to illuminate and solve the most critical financial challenges facing American households. And a way that we think about the North Star for that work is for all households in America to have enough wealth to be able to maintain financial stability, be resilient, invest in their family's well being, and to participate fully in society, the economy, and our democracy. So today we're talking about the wealth of renter households. Do renter households have wealth? If not, why not? And what can be done about it? Renters make up about a third of all US households, and both the number and percent of renter households are projected to grow. So while home equity is the largest source of wealth for most people in the US, a wealth building approach that focuses exclusively on homeownership will leave out millions of households, including those in the first 15 or 20 years of their adult financial lives, since the median age of first time home buying is now 38. So, renters are a large group of US adults with their own financial lives and circumstances. They're not simply homeowners in waiting, which is why we need to pay more attention to the financial well being of renters. What financial challenges do they face, and what are the opportunities for improvement and growth? And in particular, how could renters see greater financial well being and wealth if they had more stable housing costs and more positive cash flow? Which is why I'm so delighted to welcome you to this morning's conversation on what it will take to grow renter wealth. First, we'll hear from my colleague, Stephen Brown, Aspen FSP's Director of Insights and Evidence, on the findings from his new research into the financial lives of renters. Then we'll have a panel conversation moderated by Shena Ashley, Vice President at Capital One Community Impact and Investment and President of the Capital One Insight Center. And she'll be in conversation with three experts in the financial lives of renters and solutions that can help them build wealth. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom center of your screen as they come to you. And finally, before I turn it over to Stephen, I want to thank the Capital One Insight Center for their partnership and financial support of this work, without which we would not be able to bring you this research and event. So with that, Stephen, if you want to turn your camera on, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Really excited to talk with you all this morning. My name, as Jen pointed out, Stephen Brown. I'm Director of Insights and Evidence today. And I'll be presenting some findings from some research that my colleague Sherry Arnabi and I published earlier in November of 2024 about renter wealth. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the presentation. Okay. So why focus on renters and why now? Uh, So I'm going to go through a few numbers just off the top, just to frame the discussion a little bit. So 22%. That's the increase in median rent for a two-bedroom apartment between 2019 and 2024. Though the rents peaked in the summer of 2022, they flattened a little bit since then. But 20%, 22% increase over the past 5 years. $420,400. That's the median home sales price as of Q3 of 2024. These are near record highs and up over $100,000. Over $100,000 at the median since 2019. 38 years old, the median age of the first-time home buyer, which is also a new record, and up 5 years since 2019. And again, in context, right, that it means that for over half of renters, they don't even buy their first house until after they're 38 years old. So there's 15, 20 years of life and financial life they're figuring out before they even enter into this primary asset. And then 24%, the share of first-time homebuyers among all homebuyers, right? So only among all homes that were sold in 2024, only a quarter were first-time homebuyers, which is a new record and down 9 percentage points since 2019. And so what this all says is that we need to, it's impossible to deny at this point that renters are being constrained both in the price of rent, but also the access to this primary form of wealth building has gotten much harder for renters to be able to get into, to be able to buy and purchase. And that constraint means that we need to really bring increased attention to what it looks like to build wealth as renters, whether they may never become homeowners or maybe they don't become homeowners until their late 30s or 40s. What does this wealth building journey for renters look like with the focus on them as renters? Because again, I think these constraints, these changes over the past few years have really called for a rethinking of how we think about the financial well-being and the wealth building opportunities for renters. And so turning a little bit to the demographics of renters, who are renters, right? They are so what we have here are the demographics of household heads from 2022. They're younger than renter household heads are on the younger end. They're 42 years old compared to 57 for homeowners. And so renters are younger, but probably even maybe a little bit older than you would have assumed. The heads are primarily female and also predominantly people of color. That's this blue box down at the bottom. 51%, a little over half of all renter household heads are folks of color, right? And so when we think about who the renter population is, they're younger, they're more diverse. It's the future of the country in some ways. And so that also, I think, demands an increased focus on renters as we think about who we're serving, who's coming up ahead, what is it that they need in order for their financial well-being, in order to build wealth. And turning to their income, nearly half of renters have incomes under $50,000, but over a fifth of them make over $100,000. So looking at the median household income in 2023, a little under $78,000 for all households. For renters, yes, have substantially lower median incomes at $51,000. But even then, that's a $10,000 increase in real income between 2013 and 2023. And so renters' incomes are increasing. And the difference is we're seeing an increase in the number of renter households, or proportion of renter households making higher incomes. So between 2013 and 2023, like lower income renters under 25,000 proportionally fell, but the proportion of renters making over 100,000 rose over that time period. And so as we look forward to who the future of renters are, right, we are seeing a community that's younger, more diverse, higher earning, but yet it's still difficult for them to be able to access home ownership in this current market. And so this all makes us wonder, like, well, what does financial well-being look like for renters? What does wealth building look like for renters? And using some data from Survey Consumer Finances, we looked at the wealth of renters and the wealth of homeowners between 2016 and 2022. And between 2019 and 2022, there were substantial increases in wealth across the board. Pretty much any demographic group you break down, you'll see increases. But for renters, even though they saw this record increase, they still only have 3% of the wealth of homeowners, right? $10,400 compared to nearly $400,000 for the wealth of homeowners. Homeowners' wealth increased $100,000 between 2019 and 2022. And so even though we see renters creeping up in income, we see increases in their assets and increases in their wealth, they're still falling far behind the wealth of homeowners. And so this is a question for us is like, well, what does it look like for these folks who are trying to build wealth through the various channels, trying to improve their financial well-being? What are both the challenges and opportunities for them to be able to do that, right? And so the opportunity is that the renter homeowner wealth gap is not due completely to home equity, right? So median home equity is $200,000, which is just over half of the $400,000 we just saw on the slide before. 78% of homeowners own a potentially, and so 78% of homeowners own a potentially appreciating asset other than their primary residence. So if you take out the homes, you're thinking about stocks, you're thinking about retirement accounts, 78% of homeowners own an asset, but only 48% of renters own an asset. And so even outside of what homeownership, that primary asset, there's still people have a portfolio of assets. They have a portfolio to be able to build wealth. And so what does that look like between renters and homeowners? And this suggests, given that for a lot of homeownership, homeowners' wealth is outside of homeownership, it's primarily homeownership, but it's not exclusively homeownership, that suggests potential for important wealth building pathways for renters, whether or not they become a homeowner, pathways that might even be open to them even on the younger end of their adulthood. So, what does that look like for them? But I think the challenge is that renters have lower levels of financial stability and income compared to homeowners. They have lower cash flow, higher debt, lower savings, credit constraints, and cash flow in particular is of concern. Only 39% of renters have incomes that exceed their spending in any given month compared to a little over half of homeowners. And on this point of cash flow, right? Renters consistently have lower cash flow than homeowners. You can see right over the past few years. And so cash flow being households with income greater than their expenses in the prior month. And we see renters at no point in the past few years have broken over, no more than half of renters have had positive cash flow in the prior month. And so that presents a real challenge for them to be able to have the excess income in order to dedicate towards savings, in order to dedicate towards debt pay down, and dedicate towards asset building. And we know that one of the primary drivers, not the only one, but a primary driver of is rent. Rent can be a particular challenge for renters and that higher cost of living in order to be able to have the additional cash flow needed to dedicate towards savings and assets. And we see this not just at the lower end of the spectrum, but up the income spectrum. And so this is the same, looks at something similar, but broken down by income. And what we see consistently is that within certain income, within each income band, renters still have less cash flow than homeowners do, even within the same income band, right? And so this is not just a factor of renters have lower incomes than homeowners do. There's still a cash flow issue for renters across the income spectrum. But even with those cash flow constraints, we've seen increases in assets and declines in debt over the past few years. And so this is the relative increase in assets and wealth and debt since 2007, so basically right before the Great Recession. And we see this green line like kind of dipping post-Great Recession, and since 2016 has been kind of moving upward, particularly in the past 3 years. We see a big increase in the value of renter assets. We see declines in renter debts. And so there is progress being made, even with these constraints in cash flow, even with homeownership being hard to access. And so for here, right, so I think it's important to think about what does asset ownership look like for renters? And all renters own some form of asset, basically, right? But when we focus that to just potentially appreciating assets, things that can help you build wealth over time. Again, less than half of renters own any potentially appreciating asset compared to 78% of homeowners. And that is a substantial gap that's hindering their ability to be able to build wealth, whether through homeownership or through other means. Though we did see renters have across the board increases in asset ownership since 2019. And just really briefly, like looking at different types of potentially appreciating assets, even as you move up the income spectrum, we do see renters both increasing the percentage of holding those assets and also the amounts, right? Retirement accounts increase dramatically as we move up the income spectrum, business ownership, real estate ownership. And so there is potentially a pathway for folks who are higher income, but there's still that gap there, especially for folks on the lower end of the income spectrum to figure out what are the assets they can attain, what does wealth building look like for them. So what are the solutions here, right? The solutions are we to address rent burdens and residual cash flow, right? Renters, in order to be able to build wealth, need the cash to put towards the assets to be able to put towards savings, pay down debt, and that can come through both income, but also reducing expenses, like expanding the supply of housing will help bring down those rents and make it easier for renters to be able to pay their rent move into other asset building. But we also need to increase renters' access to a broader portfolio of assets through building cash savings, strengthening access to retirement savings and to securities and market-based investing. We need to expand the implementation of early wealth building accounts. Baby bonds are an example of that. So we need renters to have access to a broader array of assets that isn't just homeownership. But homeownership does remain critical, right? And so we need to increase those pathways as well. And so this is very much a both and. We need to address the rent burdens, but when it comes to asset building, we need a both and approach. We need to expand access to home ownership, but we need to expand access to a broader way of asset building as well. There's a big gap to make up, but I think there is a lot of work to do. But given the demographics, given the need for renters to be able to build wealth, given their growth, it does, I think, behoove all of us to pay more attention to this population and to figure out how to support greater financial well-being and wealth building for renters. So with that, I want to expand it to bring in the rest of the panelists to turn on their screens.
Stephen, thank you so much for that great overview of the research. Our team here at Capital One, very excited about the insights that were developed here. This focus on renter wealth is something that's been important to us as we've been trying over the past 5 years through our Impact Initiative to expand economic opportunity for all Americans. Renters are a big part of that. And so having this kind of first of its kind consolidated research that really concentrates on understanding where there are opportunities for us to grow wealth in this particular market segment has been really helpful to us in our strategy and in our outlook looking forward. And as we're thinking about our $265 billion community benefits plan commitment under our proposal for the acquisition of Discover, having data and insights that help us ground a philanthropic and a research strategy that allows us to really work on what you are surfacing here on what it will actually take to grow wealth in this population is critical for moving this population forward. So thank you so much for this research and for partnering with us. We're really excited to have and continue the partnership that has been started through this work. And now with that, I'll take an opportunity to bring on the real experts around this so that I'm not hogging the mic, but to bring folks who have been at the coal face of moving toward these solutions to give us some insight into how we can actually continue to move this forward. I am so happy that this is a solution-focused conversation and that we're not dwelling in the challenges that are facing here, but really equipping each other with ways that we can move forward in that. So I am joined today by a really great group of panelists. We have Marquita, Matt, and David, who are going to share all of the insights that we need to actually move forward on this work. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves as part of the first question that we'll bring forward during this work. So I'm going to go in this order, Marquita, Matt, and David. Please tell me, drawing from your work and the focus of your organization, what does it mean to you and in your organization's interventions to strengthen financial well-being and wealth for renters? Marquita?
Thank you so much, Shena. Good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation. I'm Marquita Morris-Louis. I'm CEO of Compass Working Capital. I'm in chilly, frigid Philadelphia this morning. Compass is a national nonprofit working to end asset poverty for families with low incomes and narrow the racial and gender wealth divides. And I'm a Scorpio, so while we're introducing ourselves. At Compass, we talk about financial well-being and wealth building in the context of asset poverty. And being asset poor means not having enough money to live at the federal poverty level for 3 months without income. And for a family of 3, which is the average size family that we serve, that means just having about $6,000 in savings. So we're not talking about kind of balling out money. That's all it would take for a family to move from meeting the definition of asset poor to becoming what we call asset secure. And as you know, our society does very little to help renters build assets, particularly families who live in any forms of subsidized housing. And the rules for families who are interacting with our social safety net, most of whom are renters, often penalize families for building assets. And that requires them to choose between meeting their immediate needs often and planning for the future. So our vision at Compass is to end asset poverty for millions of families that are interacting with our social safety net by integrating high quality, people-centered, and culturally relevant financial coaching with externally funded savings programs. I want to make that very clear. We're not asking families to save their already limited resources. We want them to have access to savings opportunities through external funded savings programs, including those that are government enabled. And I'll actually speak to some of that later in the webinar when that questions about solutions come up. So in particular, we believe that our nation's social safety net and public assistance system should be making asset building the norm and not the exception so that families can achieve financial well-being and economic mobility. And liquid savings and strong credit are actually two very powerful assets toward that end. The former allows us, as we all know, to weather financial shocks, invest in the future, including acquiring additional assets. And the latter, a strong credit profile, allows us to make critical wealth building investments by also reducing the cost of participating in our economy. So our public policy, at least when it comes to families experiencing poverty, is very, very income focused. And that's really focused on patronizing notions grounded in over-indexing in participation in labor force. When we don't reward labor with equitable tax policy, that's a whole different conversation. But then we erect obstacles for families with low incomes who receive government benefits to actually build savings, like asset limits. So we all know that assets plus income, not income alone, is really what allows families to put some distance between themselves and poverty. And the families we work with tell us that liquid savings provides, yes, tangible financial well-being, right? The idea of having self-insurance against disruptions in cash flow, because we all know, and many of us and our families have experienced, that one expected expense can create a cascade effect of financial calamity. But what it also provides, having access to liquid savings provides not just the tangible financial well-being, but the psychological well-being, right?
Yes.
And the reduced stress of knowing that in its pure existence, they can weather storms as they come. So this is why we believe that we need to be having this conversation, and I really appreciate being part of it.
Oh, Marquita, so many gems in there. You were about to take us all in on different elements there. We'll come back to some of those in the discussion. Matt, over to you. Tell us about your organization and your perspective on financial well-being for renters.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Matt Despardon, Vice President for Research and Policy with Safer Life. We're a national nonprofit financial technology and advocacy organization. And as the name implies, we have focused quite a bit on helping our members build savings and wealth. And thank you very much for Aspen for hosting this conversation this morning. A very important one to have. So I'd say just in terms of strengthening financial well-being, I agree with Marquita on all points. The number one thing is to increase financial slack, income that usually exceeds expenses each month. But this is only true for 26% of our members. So I really appreciate Aspen's first recommendation that we need to address rent cost burdens to free up some residual positive cash flow. And the idea, having some positive cash flow among our members, it predicts all other aspects of financial health. And so if you have slack, you are better off financially on every other indicator. And it's needed, like Marquita was describing, to have short-term savings. We found in a recent study that having even just $500 or more in short-term savings significantly lowers the risks of having problems paying for housing. So we need to focus on building more slack to build emergency savings, but we also need for members to have less debt or more manageable debt, so that their debt to income ratio would meet underwriting guidelines for mortgages. Building wealth, yeah, it means saving for a down payment, but it also means maxing out employer matching in defined contribution plans. And I know that's, of course, for longer term retirement related savings. But it's still very important, an important aspect of wealth building. But ultimately, our members face a lot of barriers to navigating pathways to homeownership. And unfortunately, many do not have access to workplace retirement plans. And so for those of you who have heard me harp on this before, it's for that group of workers who don't have access to that, they're missing out on all the good things that are packed into the Secure 2.0 Act concerning retirement savings.
Love that focus on retirement plans there, Matt. David, you want to join us and tell us about your organization and your perspective on the financial well-being of renters?
Yes, good morning, and thank you, Sheena, and thank you, Stephen, for doing this. I'm David Kemper. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Trust Neighborhoods. We're a national nonprofit, but we do our work in a deeply place-based way of supporting existing neighborhood-based organizations in neighborhoods which face shorthand gentrification in setting up community-governed mixed-income housing through mixed-income neighborhood trusts. They're focused on preventing the displacement of renting residents, on making those neighborhoods even better places to live, and really importantly, on building community power and power for renters in those neighborhoods. We've now established 5 of these mixed income neighborhood trusts that are now stewarding housing in Fresno, in Tulsa, in Kansas City, in Boston, and most recently, as a couple months ago, in Denver and Aurora. Pertinent to this panel, one, we always support existing partners that are prioritizing preventing the displacement of renting residents. This is a big jump if you spend time with a lot of neighborhood-based organizations. They're very homeowner dominated and do not necessarily care if renting residents are displaced, even if they are the majority of those neighborhoods. This is important both, as the panel has already talked about, in stabilizing housing costs. It's also really important from the value of place. In the wake of Rod Shetty and so many others, we really understand how much place matters. And if you look at studies of these neighborhoods that are changing disproportionately in value upwards, the residents which lose out from that are renting residents. And not only do they lose out, the studies show they are pushed out to places where their incomes are lower, their education outcomes are lower, their safety is lower, which is a deeply painful side of residents who often are part of making that neighborhood an even better place to live. For renting residents, that not only does not make their life better, it makes their life worse in a lot of these ways, which we've talked about of being meaningful for savings. But these are also neighborhoods where they have social capital. They have social fabric. They have their kids in schools. And so really important is that anti-displacement aspect for this. The second is we set these mixed income neighborhood trusts as legal trusts. This is a distinction within the broader community land trust effort, that these are perpetual purpose trusts. A lot of these have been used for stewarding operating companies for founders. Patagonia is now controlled by a perpetual purpose trust. In this case, we've been supporting neighborhoods and using that legal structure to have the beneficiary be the neighborhood long-term to a literal trust structure. And really important in that is renting residents being a beneficiary. One key part of that is there's a portion of profits stewarded by that perpetual purpose trust called a purpose reserve, which does go to the benefit of residents. And in those purposes is that renting residents are part of that benefit. That's really important for, as Marquita talks about, ways to have funds outside of the renter's existing money come into things like producing savings. Those purpose reserves can be used towards those purposes. And finally, they're at the direction of a trust stewardship committee. And that trust stewardship committee has renting residents in real positions of power in stewarding these assets. The East Boston Neighborhood Trust is already more than a $50 million asset and has renting residents in real positions of power in how that is stewarded, both in the governance of the housing, but really importantly also in what that looks like for funds and the purpose reserve long term. So we are really delighted by this project. There's certainly a lot of need we're seeing, and we're happy to be here.
Okay, I thought that was going to be a softball, but early intro question, and we've gotten to the psychological dynamics, we've gotten to power dynamics. This is a really fruitful conversation where we're going to need like a whole nother hour. So I'm calling this part 1 because I think there's so much to unpack in this. But quick round robin for everyone, and we'll bring Stephen in here first to just like put him on the spot. But want to just get your quick reflection on like, come on, seriously, get down to the brass tacks. Is it possible for renters to build wealth without becoming homeowners? Like, are we dreaming of a different world here? Or are we still talking about a path to homeownership? Stephen, give me your up, down, your quick sense on, is it actually possible?
Yeah, of course. It's possible and necessary. I think so, but to qualify that, right? Do we have an adequate replacement for home ownership at that level, right? Are we going to be able to make up that full, multi-$100,000 difference? I don't see that happening right now. But could we cut that in half? Should we cut that in half? More than like, yes, I think we have to. And I think that certainly is possible. And I think we have to, people on the panel, I think there are other opportunities for folks to be able to um, build into other assets. We're trying to think more about other shared ownership, other kinds of thinking more about putting more to retirement. I think there are other ways people are thinking about investing more in the stock market. We have other levers that people are exploring, but I think it's both possible and necessary, even if it may not be a one-to-one substitution for buying a home. But every additional dollars of wealth building is going to make a difference.
Okay. We have some options that we need to continue building. That's the verdict from Stephen. Marquita, where do we fall on this?
I 100% agree with Stephen that the differential there will be probably a differential in asset value, but we have to invest in other opportunities. Like assets should be seen as a portfolio of things. And also a lot of homeowners, particularly Black and brown homeowners, the majority of their wealth is in their home. And so that lack of diversification can be problematic. We're seeing this, unfortunately, with the wildfires in LA and other, devastation. We're seeing this with appraisal bias and all the ways that actually homeowner or real estate-based wealth is stripped from communities of color. So homeownership as like the single solution for wealth building for what I'm calling regular people is deeply problematic, and it's a set of policy choices that we make, and we can make different choices to enable and to accelerate wealth building in other avenues. We, the collective we, the political will of we, just need to make different kinds of choices to spur asset building in other ways.
Oh, good point. And you're reminding us that when we look at the data and we're seeing things on average, that the equity built up in home ownership really is there. But in particular communities and for certain areas, when you disaggregate, that growth in equity isn't guaranteed, by neighborhood to neighborhood if you're going to actually get that. So really important reminder for diversification. And I love the portfolio model and thinking about this.
Shena,
Matt,
one other point is that also the cost of homeownership, like homeownership doesn't always provide the cost stability that people believe it does. I mean, rising insurance costs or the unavailability of insurance, rising property taxes. So there are also things that eat into that asset value. And again, diversification is super important in that context.
Yes, good reminder. Matt, where are you? Up, down, optimist, pessimist? Where are we?
Sorry, folks.
Yep.
A little internet blur. Okay. So here's my is not without a subsidy, some type of subsidy, and simply because wages and wage growth are not sufficiently outpacing basic living expenses to build meaningful amounts of.
Got it. Matt, I think we're getting you. Do you hear us?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm back. I'm definitely having some Zoom issues.
It's okay.
Yeah, so the residual savings that Stephen and his team talks about in the report it's just too low. Particularly considering the fact that nearly half of all Americans don't have enough in emergency savings. So before I get to subsidies, I think it also will help to discharge some debt, cracking down on nonprofit hospitals that are not providing charity care as they are legally required to do so, which is pushing and driving medical debt, and continuing to pursue income-driven repayment options for student debt that includes principal cancellation. So we need to wipe away some debt. That would help. I love Aspen's continued focus on early wealth building accounts with a sufficient means tested transfer. I think that's what's going to be more meaningfully impacting wealth building. Of course, that doesn't touch today's adult renters. For them, maybe some type of refundable renter's tax credit with advance payment to help build some slack. But for this to work, there'd have to be an increase in housing supply, I think, to offset the inflationary effect of the credit. because that credit will just, push demand even further than now. I'm really intrigued by shared ownership models, renter equity, employee ownership, neighborhood trust. Curious to know what are the mechanisms to scale those innovations up, facing market forces. But I agree with Marquita that this really comes down to political will. Bob Casey's 401k Kids Savings Account Act had no Republican co-sponsors in the Senate. It's a very, very friendly bill, and it was merely referred to the Senate Finance Committee with no subsequent action. So I think there has to be some new political language around wealth building, ideally one that taps into populist sentiment on both the left and the right.
That's great, Matt. I'm optimistic, especially building on your point around increasing housing supply, that this might be a political moment where we're able to gain some traction there from all sectors to start to really try to do what it takes to move increases in housing supply, and that will open up the conversation for us to really think about how that contributes to wealth. So appreciate those insights there. David, bring us home. Where are you? Up, down?
Yeah, I think very much agree with Marquita and Matt on the pieces they saw. A big part is, can you stabilize while then having a place to build assets alongside this? I thought from the report, really interesting was that growth and access to securities. And some of these places where you go, there are investments that maybe even outperform homeownership that renting residents can start to get access to and then be stewarded properly with more access to those accounts. And a lot of the work that Marquita and Matt are working on.
Excellent. Excellent. Marquita, I take it from your responses that you see a system approach to a lot of this. So I'm going to go to you directly with the next question. Is this something that we can solve on the consumer level? We're centering the renter, which forces us to center that individual, but is the solution at that level, or is it something that you see is broader in terms of supply, affordability, et cetera?
Oh, I'm a big systems person, because it's systems that created the racial wealth gap and just, wealth inequality, period. Actually, I want to quickly go back to Matt's point about kind of subsidizing the kind of wealth building for renters. And if you eliminated the mortgage interest deduction, that could be a start, right? Like, because that's a place where we have decided to further homeownership and support homeownership through public policy. So we could make a different decision and shift the $120 billion we spent on the mortgage interest tax deduction towards renters. But yes, so I certainly believe in systemic solutions. And one that I just want to highlight is something that Compass has been working on scaling for years, and its existing program that's been around 35 years called Family Self-Sufficiency is available to families who live in housing subsidized by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Essentially, families in HUD-assisted housing pay about 30% of their income towards rent. When their income goes up, they experience a proportionate increase in rent. And so that can feel like a tax on each additional dollar. But families in this program can basically, when they have a rent increase, they can save their rent increase. So if I'm paying $200 in rent, and then my income goes up so that my rent goes up to $500 a month, that's $300 a month that families can save. And they can save it for up to 5 years. And that's $18,000 for a family living in HUD-assisted housing. So a couple other quick facts. I just mentioned that the account builds over time. And what's beautiful is that it's not counted towards other means tested benefits like childcare subsidies or towards asset limits. So it tries to interrupt the cliff effect. It has no impact on a family's rental subsidy, what their participation or non-participation. The savings is not subject to federal income tax, which is a very unique function of it. And most importantly, families can use that savings for whatever they want. They graduate from the program, they get a check. So they can use it to become asset secure, to have that psychological kind of safety I mentioned earlier, to achieve other financial goals. And we see a lot of our families are using that. So we've been running these programs nationally with public housing authorities and more recently with private owners of HUD-assisted housing. And families are using that money to pay down debt, just to have savings in the bank for the first time, to invest in education or entrepreneurship. Yes, some are using it to purchase homes as well, but not every market even makes that, available to them. Boston is our home base, and the median home price in Boston is $989,000. Most people are not buying homes in the city of Boston, even with a lot of additional subsidy. So this program right now serves about 65,000 households nationally, when we estimate like 2.5 million could benefit. And so we've been working to scale both the scope and the impact of this program, directly partnering with folks to operate it, but also then working with folks at at HUD to make sure that there are good policies for its implementation, and then federally to appropriate more dollars to support the operation and scale. And then our big vision is really normalizing the idea of families having access to an opportunity like that by testing an opt-out model for it. Imagine if, families got a housing choice voucher, and automatically, if their income goes up and their rent goes up, they can take advantage of this asset account that's building in the background. So that's our vision. And this is a solution. This is not new. There's nothing created. It's shovel ready. It just needs investment and opportunity to scale.
That is really a great one to highlight, Marquita. And just a call out to our folks in the audience, please do send questions. We're getting some great questions for the panelists. While I move to the next question, Marquita, just to put in your ear, a question that came from the audience to think about is how we are able to intervene with residents and people in their very busy lives to start doing some of that saving. So if you have any approaches that you could put in the chat, or we'll come back to at the end, it'd be really great. People want to know, like, how do we do this? It seems great, but people are busy and stressed. So how do we get them to move on? David, over to you. I was really intrigued in your opening response as you were talking about power shifting and the power building work that is a part of the intervention and solution that you have. How is narrative change and power shifting part of shaping the art of the possible here and moving renters toward greater wealth building? What are you seeing in your work?
Yeah, I think that's key, not only in the particular side of stewarding assets and creating the extra savings and assets for renters, but even building broader policies like expanding FSS and updating FSS. Like building policies we can't even think of now is having renters both in more positions of power and in places where they have the security and can shape those broader narratives, as well as just destigmatizing and expanding what it means to be a renting resident in the United States. And I think we heard this from so many different residents in the neighborhoods we've worked with already. There was one resident in one of the first ones we helped set up a neighborhood trust in, and she said, I've not got involved in my neighborhood-based organization because they are very homeowner dominated. They say they care about renters, but if you go to the meetings, everything they're working on is benefiting homeowners. And if I get kicked out, they don't really care. And she'd had this experience in the neighborhood beforehand. She'd actually helped make a better neighborhood. She'd helped shut down a drug house in her neighborhood, and had talked about once there was no more drug house, my rent went up. I got kicked out. Now I live in this neighborhood. I see the neighborhood organization doing the same thing again. She actually stepped in to become a member of the trust stewardship committee of that neighborhood organization and got very involved because there's a real vehicle in place for her to do that. And also from that place is sitting alongside other prominent stakeholders in the neighborhood, talking about her experience, talking about what it means to be a renter. And you can really hear even the tone from the early workshops and sessions setting up these neighborhood trusts to then later on as residents are governing together, change from residents who aren't renters of really understanding what that experience means. And what that looks like. And we need to see this at every layer in US society in a way that actually builds out a society that just destigmatizes what is such a large portion of our society.
That is so critical. It's a lot to solve at the individual level and making sure you have the assets moving, but being seen as part of the fabric of the community, as you're speaking to, David, is really important, in making sure that others see the real value that renters are having and not pulling down a neighborhood's growth. Matt, this is a very evidence-based conversation. I know Saber Life has been doing research in this area as well. So invite you to add in any insights or additional things that you found in your work that could help us land towards some solutions, and then we'll go to audience questions.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's interesting is the statistic I mentioned earlier, 26% of our members do not have financial slack, or excuse me, pardon me, only 26% have financial slack. The majority, 74%, have income that is just breaking even or is actually below expenses. And so I think what we've realized is, as alarming as the 74% figure is, we are potentially missing some opportunities about what we can do with the 26% of members who do have financial slack. And as Stephen and I have talked about, particularly those who seem to have investable amounts of savings in assets that are maybe sitting in ruddy old, 0.5% standard savings accounts. And nothing against savings accounts. They're not ruddy, but that interest rate could be much better. But I think there has to be like extraordinary care with any kind of things we do collectively to try to help people who we can see, you're maybe a little bit beyond struggling now. You're beginning to accumulate some assets. Tremendous amount of care around whatever we do with respect to the risks of and not just of investing, but even of home ownership. We need to not assume that home ownership is always the right path. We know that there's a racial component to this, that Black homeowners property values rise at much lower rates. Their pathway to equity building through home ownership is much more constrained, and that relates back to what David was talking about with respect to place. And so, yeah, I'd just say there's opportunities, but proceed with caution.
Really interesting there to think about flipping the focus to the ones that do have the bandwidth to save, and making sure that we are also centering in the narrative, David, like what people are doing to build assets and wealth. And we don't really hear a lot about that. We don't publish a lot of case studies or stories out there in the newspaper that is showing the success of those models, so that people can see themselves as renters having those pathways. And so I love that call to action, Matt, that we could really think about carefully how we move the needle with that population, but really trying to think about solutions that are there so that could serve as a model for the work. We have great questions coming in, folks. We have a little bit left of time here, so please do keep them coming. And Marquita, we'll go back to you on just like, how do we not just make this one more thing that people are stressing about? What are the ways in which we are able to intervene in people's lives, recognizing that they have these larger stresses and challenges in order to start saving and building? And then Matt, we had a question that came in around just how realistic this renter interest tax deduction is. And so I think you might have said it first. So I'm going to call on you to give us the reality check on that one. Marquita?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I responded in the Q&A that there's this, I love just the recognition that people have really complex lives, and in particular folks experiencing poverty, right? There's a lot of balls being juggled constantly, not a lot of just mental slack. So even if something feels like a really good thing, it can be difficult for folks to create the mental bandwidth in order to take advantage of it. One of the things that is really important at Compass is language and how we communicate. We like to say that, unfortunately, so many housing providers, in particular public housing authorities, lead with compliance in their messaging, and we try to lead with compassion instead. And that's definitely more resonant. And our little tagline is, "You can't spell compassion without Compass." That's cute. But what is really important is that building trust. And I love that trust neighborhoods, right? Like, I love you have to just name trust as a important component of any of this work. Folks have to trust that the programs that you're putting forth exist, trust that you have their best interests at heart, and trust that you're not going to, again, make it difficult for them to engage. So one of the things I've noted, we don't have high, requirements in terms of engaging with a financial coach. It is really You're in the driver's seat, the coach is in the passenger seat holding the GPS, right? You set the destination, the coach is saying turn right, because you've set the client has set the destination. And then what's really important is just flexibility, allowing folks multiple modes to engage. So we don't require people to meet with us in person, because you got childcare, you try to feed your children, you don't want to have to take off work, you don't want to have to think about transportation. Let's hop on the phone, let's do this by Zoom. So just creating those modes. And this was not true before the pandemic. A lot of, there was a lot of in-person requirements, also requirements that people meet in person just to sign documents. And we've done a lot of work to just create deep engagement through remotely. So centering families' lives, understanding what their need, and just being super people-centered in how you do all the work really helps to help people engage.
That's definitely right. And then one of the things I really appreciate about Stephen's research was that it shows this is across the income spectrum, right? So it's not just a low and moderate income issue, it's even higher income. And we meet people in their busy lives in the way that we all want to be met. Like technology solutions help me be able to manage all the things that I have. And so we don't have to think about it as a different kind of community than we are. It's all the things we want and come to expect in how we engage in our financial services, a little bit more digitally, a little bit more streamlined, having nudges to remind me to like move some savings to investment. All those things could just be made much more possible and available to everyone. So that they have the ease in not having to manage the finances in an overly complicated and burdensome way. So thank you so much for that, Marquita. Matt, back to you. Where are we on this tax bill? Is it possible? Everybody knows we have a little bit of tax reform season coming up. Anybody out there proposing this renter tax here or deduction?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. And so in terms of the feasibility, I'll actually punt. And in punting, do a shout out to Will Fisher, who's the Senior Director of Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I came across a piece he published in through the National Low Income Housing Coalition in 2021 that talks about these credits. And one of the interesting things is, there's a number of different ways you could design the credit. And one of the ways is for it to be an owner claimed credit, where the owner would be required to reduce rent each month, and you could attach other provision or requirements to that. That if you're lowering the owner's tax liability, to not only reduce rent but also to adhere to not increasing rent by a certain amount, no more than core inflation or something like that each year. And then maybe building in a renter equity provision to that a certain amount of rent payments go toward some kind of trust account or something. I'm just spitballing here. But the reason why I pointed out is because it did at the time receive a broad range of support from not just kind of left-leaning groups, but also groups like the Mortgage Bankers Association. So I think it's important that we not go back to some ideas, like not to assume, well, it didn't work in 2019 and it'll never be done again. No, let's continue to work on it. Let's continue to innovate around that idea and seek bipartisan support.
I love that. David, Matt's raising some of the things that you have seen in your work around the trust and maybe building in some equity. Is any part of your work focused on ways? We have a question that's just thinking about what resources are there to help renters face annual rent increases. And I wonder if like the funds that you're setting up as part of the trust that you're building help renters deal with some of the unexpected or expected annual increases that might be coming their way.
So I think the first thing there is in our name is trust neighborhoods. And so really key in the very structure of the neighborhood trusts is those decisions are at the discretion of the trust stewardship committee in accordance with the purpose of each neighborhood trust. And they are aware of this. These kinds of discussions have come up around, would this be better as a dividend or even paying into renter equity? And so there's a role for us as a national nonprofit helping when they ask us as an advisor for resources around what to do this, that we can literally, I was on a call with Marquita with the East Boston Neighborhood Trust team. So we have pushed them in these directions, certainly, but the really powerful thing is, at the end of the day, that the use of those resources, those decisions, in accordance with the purpose that was set up for each neighborhood trust, is at that trust stewardship committee. And really importantly, with those renting residents there at the table, navigating what is the complexity of both this struggle of homeownership and renting and changing neighborhoods. And we know those decisions will be different in what we bake in today in 2025 or in 2050, or we hope, as these are perpetual, in 2100, as we hope at that point they're stewarding quite significant assets and income streams towards the benefit of their neighborhoods. So yes, and it is really importantly at the discretion of those residents long term.
That's great, because they have the power to make those choices and really think about that. So that's a great reminder on that. This has been incredible. We've already gotten some validation in the chat that, again, this was only part one, folks. We have to come back at this again, much more to share in this. And I love the optimistic turn on this conversation. There are solutions we can take. There are new models. And as Matt said, we don't have to just decide that if it was tried before, doesn't mean it's worth continuing to put our shoulders to it. We can absolutely advance this. We had a question in the chat around information around wealth building or credit building services in Chicagoland. I would love to do a plug for Working Credit, who operates out of Chicago and helps with credit building. And the thing that's so great about this conversation is it's raising all the different levers that we need about it. So all these things need to come into play as we think about increasing the spending power and the slack resources that are available for renters in order to be able to move toward wealth building. So just wanted to make sure that we answered that. And now my time's up. Over to you, Stephen, to close us out. Thank you all.
Thank you. And before I close, I just wanted a couple of things I wanted to just throw in there really quickly. One, the conversation did not touch that much on supply, and I know this is probably on some folks' minds. And I think we want to, supply is critically important. It is so important for, like, we do not have enough housing, rental housing, housing to buy. Like, that is critical to unsticking so much of this. But I think something to keep in mind is that increasing supply is going to bring down the cost and hopefully make things more affordable and hopefully put more money in people's pockets. But even with the more money in their pockets, they still have to go towards other resources. So this is really a both and. Like, how do we increase supply to bring down cost? But also, what are the other assets and opportunities to be able to buy into assets that people have access to? I want to give a plug to the Enterprise Wealth Creation Fund, and they've been doing some really interesting work around cashback for renters, trying to think about getting renter equity and like renter cost sharing into their developments. And so I would encourage you to go look at them and look at some of the work that they're doing. But there's some opportunities around here. The people on this call have been doing some really cool work as well. Thank you again to Capital One. Thank you for all of our audience members for coming out. I just want to reiterate, we do think this is a solvable problem with all the folks on this call and all the people participating, all of your organizations helping to figure out like how we bring down costs and expand asset building opportunities for renters. So again, thank you all. Really appreciate it. And yeah, be on the lookout for all these resources and hopefully a part two.